It had been one of those long weeks at the office where time seemed to crawl. The same routine every day. Typing away on the computer, answering emails, attending meetings that felt endless. The office was always busy, but somehow it always felt lonely for him. He wasn't the kind who talked much or joined in the office gossip. He just did his work quietly and went home. People knew his name, but not much else about him. To most, he was just that quiet guy who always stayed in the corner. There was nothing wrong with that, but in a place where loud voices and confident talkers ruled, silence made him stand out, and not in a good way. Some coworkers found it funny. They liked making jokes about how serious he looked all the time. Others just ignored him, thinking he had nothing interesting to say. He never argued or fought back. He just smiled politely, even when it stung a little. One Friday afternoon, something unusual happened. The HR department sent out a group email inviting everyone to the company's annual dinner. It was supposed to be a fun evening. Food, laughter, music, maybe a few speeches from the management. People were excited, already talking about what they would wear and who would be coming with whom. For him, though, it didn't seem like much of a big deal. Events like that weren't really his thing. He preferred quiet evenings at home, maybe with a book or his piano. Later that day, when he checked his inbox again, there was another message, a personal invitation this time. The email said, "You're specially invited to the annual dinner this Saturday evening. The CEO will also be there, so we hope to see you." He stared at the message for a moment, wondering why it said, "Specially invited." He wasn't part of any important team. He hadn't done anything recently that stood out. It didn't make sense. When he mentioned it to a few coworkers, they exchanged glances and tried not to laugh. One of them grinned and said, "Oh, you got the VIP invite? Maybe they just need someone to make us all laugh." The others burst out laughing. He didn't join in. He forced a smile, trying not to let it bother him. That night, while sitting alone in his small apartment, the words kept replaying in his head. Make us all laugh. Maybe they really did invite him as some kind of joke. The thought made him uneasy. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, straightened his shirt, and sighed. He knew how people saw him. Quiet, shy, maybe even strange. But still, he didn't want to skip the dinner. He told himself it was just one evening, and maybe things wouldn't be as bad as he imagined. When Saturday arrived, he spent half the day debating whether to go or not. The invitation card sat on his table, untouched, as if waiting for him to make a final decision. Around evening, he finally got ready. He wore a simple but neat outfit, a white shirt and dark blazer. Nothing fancy, but it made him look presentable. Before leaving, he glanced at the piano in the corner of his room. It had been with him for years, almost like an old friend. Playing it was the only time he truly felt at peace. He smiled softly before heading out. The hotel where the event was held looked grand. Bright lights, expensive decorations, and a red carpet stretched at the entrance. He felt slightly out of place as he walked in. Everyone looked confident, laughing and talking in groups. Some of his colleagues noticed him and waved, but not in a warm way. It was the kind of wave that said, "Oh, you actually came?" He smiled anyway and made his way inside. The ballroom was filled with round tables, shiny silverware, and the faint sound of a live band setting up in the corner. He noticed a grand piano placed near the stage, its black surface gleaming under the lights. For a moment, his eyes lingered on it. It reminded him of home, of quiet nights spent playing soft tunes to unwind from long days. He quickly looked away, not wanting to seem distracted. He found a seat near the back, away from the crowd. From there, he could see everyone. The department heads laughing together, the CEO greeting guests with a smile, the waiters moving swiftly between tables. It all looked beautiful from a distance, but deep down he still felt invisible. As the evening went on, more people arrived. The room was filled with chatter and the sound of glasses clinking. He sat quietly, listening, trying to blend in. Occasionally, someone from his team would walk past and throw a teasing comment. "Don't look so serious," one said. Another chuckled, "You'll scare the CEO like that." He just nodded and laughed softly, pretending it didn't hurt. The dinner began and speeches followed. The CEO stood on the stage, thanking everyone for their hard work and dedication. The crowd clapped and cheered. Then came the funny stories, moments from the office shared by different managers. People laughed loudly, especially when someone made a joke about the quiet ones in the company. A few people turned their heads toward him, smirking. He pretended not to notice. He tried to focus on his meal instead, but it was hard to swallow when the laughter felt aimed at him. He kept thinking, why did I come here? Maybe they really did invite him just to make fun of him. After a while, the atmosphere became lighter again. The live band started playing a few soft tunes. The event planner announced there would be a short entertainment break before the CEO's closing speech. Some people went to dance, others stood near the bar, chatting. He stayed seated, still feeling like an outsider watching from afar. Then, out of nowhere, one of his coworkers came up behind him and said loudly, "Hey, our quiet guy's here. Maybe he'll give us a performance." A few people turned and laughed. Someone added, "Yeah, maybe he can juggle or something." The laughter grew louder. He didn't know what to say. He smiled politely, though his heart sank. It was supposed to be a harmless joke, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like everyone in the room was watching him, not with respect, but amusement. The event organizer chuckled and said, all right, let's not make him uncomfortable." The crowd slowly lost interest and went back to chatting. But the damage was done. He felt smaller than ever, like he didn't belong there. He thought about leaving quietly, maybe slipping out before the event ended. But just as he was about to stand up, he heard the CEO speaking again. His voice was calm and warm. "I hope everyone's enjoying the evening," the CEO said, smiling. "It's wonderful to see so much energy in one room." The CEO's presence had a strange effect. The laughter stopped, and people listened respectfully. Even from far back, he could feel the CEO's genuine kindness. He admired that about him. As he sat there watching, he noticed something interesting. The musicians who had been playing earlier were whispering among themselves, looking concerned. One of the instruments wasn't working properly, and the pianist had not yet arrived. The event organizer seemed stressed. He could tell from their worried faces that something wasn't going according to plan. He looked again at the grand piano, just sitting there silently under the lights. For a second, an idea crossed his mind, but he quickly brushed it away. No, that would be crazy, he thought. He wasn't there to draw attention. Still, something inside him stirred. Maybe it was the quiet frustration of being underestimated for so long. Maybe it was the way the laughter earlier had burned a little too deeply. Or maybe it was just his love for music, waiting for a moment to come alive. Whatever it was, it made him look at that piano differently, not as an instrument but as an opportunity. The night went on. People laughed, danced, and clapped to the music. But his thoughts were somewhere else. Deep down, he had no idea that this awkward evening, the one he almost skipped, was about to become the moment everyone would remember. The same people who laughed at him would soon look at him with complete silence and respect. But for now, he just sat quietly, unnoticed at the back of the room. Waiting, the ballroom shimmered with golden light as the evening carried on. The laughter of people filled the air, mixed with the faint sounds of glasses clinking and the soft rhythm of background music. It was supposed to be a celebration, a night of joy, pride, and connection. Yet, for him, the air still felt heavy, as if the laughter carried a weight he couldn't escape. He sat quietly at the back, half listening to the cheerful voices around him. His table wasn't completely empty, but the people sitting nearby barely noticed he was there. They were too busy chatting about promotions, travel plans, and office gossip. He tried to smile whenever someone glanced his way, but it never led to a real conversation. He didn't mind silence, but that night, the quiet around him felt colder than usual. The waiters moved around gracefully, serving plates of steaming food and refilling drinks. He thanked them softly each time, and they smiled politely before moving on. Every now and then, someone from across the room would catch his eye, give a small smirk and look away. It wasn't cruel, but it reminded him of what his coworkers had said earlier, that he was probably there to be the joke of the evening. The band played another tune, something cheerful, yet his heart wasn't in it. He took a sip of water and let his eyes wander across the hall. The room was stunning. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, and the walls were decorated with banners carrying the company's motto. Together we rise. It was ironic, he thought. Together, yes, but only if you fit in. Then his gaze fell on the stage. The piano still stood there, untouched. Its polished surface reflected the soft lights like a calm lake. It drew his attention every few minutes, as if quietly calling to him. He could almost feel the smoothness of the keys beneath his fingers. The thought made his heart ache in a strange way, a mixture of longing and fear. He had loved playing the piano since childhood. Back then, it was his escape. Whenever life got too noisy or confusing, he would sit down and let his fingers speak for him. Music understood what words couldn't. But that was something few people at work knew. He had never mentioned it, never thought anyone would care. A sudden burst of laughter snapped him out of his thoughts. A group of colleagues nearby were sharing stories about office mishaps. It was harmless fun until one of them said, "You know who never messes up? Him. Because he never does anything noticeable." The others chuckled. He looked down, pretending not to hear, though the words stung more than they should have. He tried to laugh it off in his mind. Maybe they didn't mean it in a bad way. Maybe it was just their kind of humor. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, the truth was simple. He was invisible to them until they needed someone to laugh about. The CEO stood near the front table, smiling warmly as he spoke to a few department heads. There was something different about the CEO. He had a calm, kind presence that filled the room without needing to be loud. People respected him genuinely. Watching him, the quiet employee wondered what it would be like to talk to someone like that. Someone who actually saw people for who they were, not for how entertaining they could be. The music faded for a moment, and the event host announced a short break before the next round of activities. People got up to stretch, refill drinks, or take photos near the stage. Some gathered around the CEO, hoping for a quick conversation. Others just took selfies, tagging the event as #CompanyNight2025. He stayed in his seat, content to simply observe. But just as he was about to take a sip of water, he noticed someone walking toward his table. It was one of his coworkers, the same one who had teased him earlier that week. "Well, look who's finally smiling," the coworker said playfully, taking the empty chair next to him. "Enjoying the night?" He nodded politely. "It's nice," he said softly. "Nice?" The coworker laughed. "Come on, man. It's supposed to be fun. You're too serious. You've got to loosen up a bit." He smiled again, even though he didn't know how to respond. The coworker leaned closer and added in a teasing tone, "You know, when I saw your name on the guest list, I was shocked. Didn't think you'd actually show up." "I almost didn't," he admitted quietly. "Why's that?" He hesitated. "I just thought maybe it wasn't really for me." The coworker shrugged. Don't think like that. It's all just for laughs. You should enjoy it. Who knows? Maybe they'll call you up on stage for something later." The words made him uneasy. "Call me up for what?" "I don't know," the coworker said with a grin. "A game, maybe. Or maybe just to make everyone laugh a little." "Don't worry. We'll cheer for you." The coworker walked away laughing, leaving him frozen in place. Make everyone laugh. The phrase echoed in his head again. So it was true, he really was there to be the joke. He looked around the room. Everyone seemed happy, unaware of how small he felt in that moment. He wondered if he should just leave quietly, slip out before anything embarrassing happened. No one would notice anyway. But then, his eyes fell once again on the piano. It stood there, calm and silent, waiting. He took a deep breath. He didn't know why, but somehow that instrument gave him courage. It reminded him that even if people laughed at him, he still had something inside that was real. Something they hadn't seen yet. As he sat there lost in thought, the lights dimmed slightly. The host announced the start of the next segment. The CEO was about to give a short talk before dinner. Everyone returned to their seats, clapping politely as the CEO walked on stage. "Good evening, everyone," the CEO said with a warm smile. "It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here tonight." This company has grown because of all of you, your hard work, your creativity, your teamwork. Tonight isn't about titles or departments. It's about people. The audience listened closely. There was something about the CEO's tone that made people pay attention. He wasn't just reading a speech, he was speaking from the heart. He continued, "Sometimes the quietest people in the room have the most powerful ideas. Sometimes the ones who go unnoticed are the ones keeping everything running smoothly. So tonight, let's not just celebrate our achievements. Let's celebrate each other." Those words hit him deeply. For a second, it felt like the CEO was speaking directly to him. His chest tightened with emotion, and he quickly looked away before anyone noticed. The CEO smiled and concluded, "Now, before we move to dinner, let's enjoy some music to lighten the mood." He turned toward the stage and looked at the band setup. "But I just heard our pianist couldn't make it tonight," he said with a slight laugh. "So unless someone here can play, we might have to skip the music." People murmured and laughed lightly. Someone from his table suddenly shouted, "Hey, maybe he can play," pointing straight at him. The laughter that followed was instant. Heads turned in his direction. Some clapped jokingly, others cheered. His heart started racing. The CEO raised his eyebrows, intrigued. "Oh, can you play?" he asked with a friendly smile. He froze. His mind went blank. The room felt smaller, the lights brighter. For a moment, he wanted to sink into his chair and disappear. But then he saw the piano again, gleaming, patient, waiting. He swallowed hard and said quietly, "A little, sir." The CEO's smile widened. "A little is better than nothing. Would you like to give it a try?" A mix of laughter and whispers filled the room. Some people chuckled. Others leaned forward eagerly. He could tell most of them thought it would be funny, that he'd make a fool of himself. But inside, something shifted. He didn't feel angry or nervous anymore. Just calm. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said softly. The CEO gestured kindly. "Please take the stage." He stood up, his legs trembling slightly but his heart steady. As he walked toward the piano, the laughter faded into murmurs. The lights above seemed to follow him, casting a soft glow on the path. For the first time that evening, everyone was watching him. Not as the quiet one in the corner, but as someone stepping into the spotlight. He reached the piano, pulled out the stool, and sat down. His fingers hovered above the keys. He took a slow breath. The room was silent. The same people who had laughed minutes ago now waited, curious. The CEO stood nearby, smiling gently, as if giving silent encouragement. He closed his eyes. The noise in his head, the jokes, the whispers, the doubts, all disappeared. All that remained was the soft hum of the piano beneath his fingertips. And in that still moment, just before he played the first note, he realized something powerful. This was his chance, not for revenge but for truth. He wasn't there to be the joke of the evening. He was there to remind them all that sometimes, the quietest person in the room can make the loudest impact. The moment his fingers touched the piano keys, the room grew still. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, where every breath and heartbeat could be heard. The crowd that had been laughing moments ago now sat waiting, some with smirks, others with curiosity. No one really expected much from him. Some even whispered that he'd probably just press a few random notes and make a fool of himself. He didn't look at anyone. His eyes were fixed on the keys, his reflection faintly visible on the glossy surface. For a brief second, doubt flickered through his mind. What am I doing? He thought. Why did I say yes? But deep inside, another voice, quiet but firm, whispered, because this is who you really are. He took a slow breath, closed his eyes, and began to play. The first few notes were soft, almost hesitant, like a whisper in a crowded room. But as his hands started to move with memory and rhythm, the melody grew stronger. The sound flowed through the air, gentle yet powerful, like a story told without words. People stopped talking. The whispers faded. Even the waiters paused mid-step, turning to see where the music was coming from. The laughter that had filled the hall just moments before melted into silence. The tune carried emotion. Not a fancy, fast piece, but something simple and heartfelt. It was the kind of music that made people remember things. Old memories, moments of love, regret, hope. Every note he played had a meaning, something real. It wasn't just performance, it was expression. He didn't look up, not once. His fingers moved smoothly, confidently. The music was flowing from a place far deeper than pride. It came from years of quiet evenings at home, where the piano was the only friend that listened. It came from all those times he was ignored or laughed at, yet chose to stay kind. It came from silence, from patience, from the quiet strength he had built without anyone noticing. The CEO, who had been standing nearby, slowly took a seat at the edge of the stage. His expression softened as he listened, his eyes thoughtful. Around the room, people leaned forward, caught in the unexpected beauty of what they were hearing. Even those who had teased him earlier felt a strange mix of admiration and shame. It was as if the music was gently reminding them how little they had truly seen. After a few minutes, the melody shifted, deeper now with more feeling. His shoulders moved slightly with the rhythm, and the hall seemed to breathe with him. Some people closed their eyes. Others simply watched in silence, completely drawn in. By the time he reached the final note, the air felt different. He let the sound fade naturally, allowing the last tone to linger before slowly lifting his hands off the keys. For a moment, no one moved. The silence that followed was heavy, not awkward, but full. Then, suddenly, the entire hall erupted into applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It was real, full, and heartfelt. He opened his eyes and looked around, almost unsure what to do. The same people who had laughed earlier were now standing, clapping, some even cheering. The sound of it hit him like a wave. He didn't smile right away. It took a few seconds for him to realize what was happening. The CEO was the first to speak. "That," he said, standing up, "was beautiful." His voice carried warmth and admiration. "You just gave us something far more meaningful than any performance we could have planned tonight." The applause grew louder. He stood slowly, bowing his head slightly, unsure what to say or how to react. His hands were still trembling, not from fear anymore, but from release. As he stepped away from the piano, the CEO reached out to shake his hand. "You didn't mention you could play like that," the CEO said, smiling. He gave a small, shy smile. "I don't really talk about it much," he replied softly. "Well," the CEO said kindly, "you should. Talent like that deserves to be seen." More people gathered around, congratulating him, asking questions. "How long have you been playing? Did you learn professionally? That was incredible." He answered each question politely, still a little overwhelmed. Some of the same coworkers who had laughed at him earlier now looked at him differently, with genuine respect. Felt strange but good. Someone handed him a glass of water, and as he took a sip, he noticed the coworker who had teased him earlier standing a few feet away, looking awkward. The coworker approached slowly, scratching his head. "Hey, that was amazing," he said quietly. "Didn't know you could do that." "Thanks," he said, smiling lightly. "Most people didn't." The coworker nodded, looking a bit guilty. "Guess we were wrong about you." He didn't respond with anger or pride. He just smiled again and said, "It's all right," because it really was. In that moment, all the teasing, all the laughter, all the quiet days of being unseen, they didn't matter anymore. He had finally shown something real, something that couldn't be ignored. The rest of the evening changed after that. The energy in the room was different. People came up to him one after another, thanking him for playing. Even strangers from other departments who had never spoken to him before wanted to shake his hand. The CEO mentioned him again in his closing speech, saying, "Tonight reminded us that sometimes, hidden among us are people with extraordinary gifts. Let's learn to see beyond the surface." Everyone clapped again, and though he tried to stay humble, he couldn't stop the warmth spreading through his chest. It wasn't pride, it was peace. After the event ended, when most people had left, he stayed behind for a few minutes. The piano was still there, silent once again. He ran his hand gently across the keys and smiled. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the lights. It almost felt like the piano had been waiting for him all along, waiting for the moment when he would stop hiding and finally let the world hear his voice. He sat down one more time, not to perform, but just to play softly for himself. The notes were light, calm, and full of gratitude. While he played, he thought about everything that had happened, the invitation, the laughter, the fear, and how it all led to this. Maybe things in life really did happen for a reason. Maybe being underestimated wasn't always a bad thing. Sometimes, it just meant that when your moment finally came, it would shine even brighter. When he finished, the hall was empty. He stood, took one last look at the piano, and walked out. The night air was cool, the city lights glowing softly outside the hotel. He pulled his jacket tighter around him and smiled to himself. He didn't know what would happen next, whether this moment would change anything at work, or if people would go back to how they were before. But one thing was certain, he had changed. He had faced his fear, not with anger or loud words, but with music. And that was enough. As he walked toward the parking lot, he heard someone calling from behind. It was the CEO. The CEO caught up to him, slightly out of breath but smiling. "You know," he said, "I've seen many people perform, but what you did tonight, that came from the heart. It takes courage to share something that personal in front of everyone." He nodded humbly. "Thank you. I wasn't sure I should." "I'm glad you did," the CEO said. "Would you mind performing at our next event? I think everyone would love to hear you again." He hesitated for a second, then smiled. "I'd like that." They shook hands, and the CEO patted him on the shoulder before heading back inside. Standing there under the soft night sky, he looked up and took a deep breath. Everything felt different now, lighter, clearer. He realized that sometimes life doesn't give you the perfect moment. You have to create it yourself. All it takes is one small act of courage, one honest moment, to turn things around. As he got into his car and started the engine, he glanced at his hands resting on the steering wheel, the same hands that had played those notes. A quiet smile spread across his face. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. He drove home through the quiet streets, the memory of the applause still echoing faintly in his ears. And though the night was ending, something inside him had just begun. That simple invitation, the one that once felt like a setup for embarrassment, had turned into the doorway to something new. He wasn't just the quiet guy at the office anymore. He was the one who played the piano when no one expected it, and made the whole room listen. The night after the event felt different from any night he'd lived through before. He couldn't sleep, though not because of worry, his mind was just too alive. The sound of applause still echoed in his ears, and every time he closed his eyes, he could see the faces of people standing and clapping. For once, they weren't laughing at him. They were cheering for him. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. It almost felt unreal. Just a few hours earlier, he had walked into that ballroom feeling small, invisible, and out of place. By the end of the night, the same room had filled with admiration and respect. It was strange how fast life could turn around, how one small moment could rewrite how people saw you. When he finally fell asleep, it was almost morning. But the next day, when he woke up, there was no tiredness, just quiet joy. He made himself a cup of tea and sat near the window, the sunlight pouring softly into the room. The piano stood in its corner, silent, yet somehow glowing in that morning light. He smiled as he looked at it. For years, it had been just his private companion. Now it had become the bridge between him and a world that had never really noticed him before. Later that day, he got a message on his phone from a coworker. "You were amazing last night. Everyone's still talking about it." He read it twice just to be sure. Another message followed, then another. Soon his inbox was filled with people congratulating him. Some who had barely spoken to him before. There were even photos of him sitting at the piano, his face calm, his hands mid-motion. One picture, taken from the back of the hall, showed the CEO clapping while everyone stood. That image made his heart warm. At work the next Monday, everything felt different. The moment he walked into the office, people greeted him with smiles. "Morning, maestro," someone joked cheerfully. Another said, You've been hiding a superstar in there all along." He laughed lightly, still not used to the attention. It wasn't overwhelming, it was just new. For once, the glances he got weren't mocking. They were kind, curious, and even respectful. The coworker who had teased him before came over and said, "Hey, I owe you an apology. I didn't realize how talented you are." He smiled gently. "It's okay," he replied. "You didn't have to." "No, I do," the coworker insisted. "That performance was incredible. You made the whole place quiet. I don't think anyone will forget that." He nodded, feeling grateful but humble. "Thank you," he said simply. During lunch, even people from other departments came by to talk to him. Some asked how long he'd been playing. Others said his music made them emotional. One woman mentioned that she cried quietly during his performance because the melody reminded her of her late father. Hearing that touched him deeply. The CEO stopped by his desk later in the afternoon. "You've become quite popular," he said with a warm grin. He stood up, feeling slightly shy. "I didn't expect that, sir." The CEO laughed softly. "That's the thing about real talent. It surprises people. I'm planning to host a smaller event next month, and I'd love for you to play there too, if you're comfortable." He paused for a moment, unsure how to respond. "I'd be honored," he said at last. "Good," the CEO said, smiling. "And thank you again for saving the evening. You reminded everyone that greatness doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes, it plays softly." When the CEO left, he sat down, feeling something deep inside. A mix of pride, gratitude, and disbelief. All the quiet days he'd spent doubting himself suddenly made sense. Maybe he wasn't meant to be loud to be noticed. Maybe being true to himself was enough. That week, something else began to change. His coworkers started treating him differently, but not in a forced way. They began asking his opinions in meetings, listening when he spoke. The same people who once dismissed his ideas now valued them. It wasn't just because of the piano. It was because they finally saw him as more than the quiet guy. One afternoon, as he was leaving work, a few younger employees stopped him. "Hey, could you teach us some piano sometime?" one asked eagerly. He laughed. "I don't know if I'm a great teacher," he said. "Come on," another added. "We saw what you did. Even just one session." He agreed, smiling. Felt good, not just the attention, but the connection. For so long, he had worked silently, blending into the background. Now, people actually wanted to learn from him. That weekend, he visited his parents. They had seen a video of his performance that someone had uploaded to the company's social page. His mother hugged him tightly as soon as he walked in. "I always told you your music would touch hearts," she said with pride. His father, who rarely showed emotion, smiled quietly and said, "I'm proud of you, son." That simple sentence meant more to him than any applause. The following weeks went by peacefully. He played the piano more often at home, not just for himself but with a new sense of purpose. He began recording short pieces, not to post online, but just to capture moments of feeling. Music had always been his private world, but now it also connected him to others in ways he never expected. At work, the CEO's new initiative, Hidden Talents, was announced. It was a monthly segment to showcase employees' hobbies and passions beyond their job roles. The idea came directly from that company dinner night. During the first announcement, the CEO mentioned, "Inspiration can come from the quietest places. Sometimes you just need to give people a chance to shine." He knew those words were for him. Soon, he helped organize the first session, encouraging others to share what they loved. One designer painted. A finance assistant sang beautifully. A technician performed a comedy act that made everyone laugh. It became a tradition, something that brought warmth and unity to the office. People often thanked him for starting it, though he never took credit. He always said, it was the CEO's idea. But deep down, he knew it all began that night with one decision: to walk up to the piano instead of walking away. Sometimes he still thought about how close he'd been to skipping the event altogether. How easy it would have been to stay home that night to avoid being laughed at. But if he had, he would have missed the moment that changed everything. One evening, as he stayed late finishing up some work, The office was quiet, much like how he liked it. The city lights twinkled through the window, and he could hear faint music from someone's phone in another room. He smiled, remembering how silence had once been his only companion. Now it was something he shared peacefully with others. He walked to the small break area where a new electric keyboard had been placed for employees to use. It was part of the Hidden Talents program, and people often gathered around it during breaks to play short tunes. He sat down and began to play softly. The melody filled the empty office, warm and gentle. Within minutes, a few people who were still working nearby came closer, listening quietly. One whispered, "He's playing again." When he finished, they clapped softly. He laughed and shook his head. "You'll make me nervous if you keep doing that," he joked. They smiled, and one of them said, "We just like listening to you. It makes the office feel alive." He nodded. "Music does that," he said quietly. "It reminds us we're all connected somehow." On his way home that night, he thought about how far he'd come, not in fame or success, but in confidence. For so long, he had believed that being quiet meant being unseen. But now he understood something deeper. Sometimes silence isn't emptiness. It's potential waiting for the right moment to speak. And when that moment comes, even a single note can change everything. As the months went by, his life continued in quiet rhythm. Work, music, family, and peace. But occasionally, people still brought up that night at the company dinner. They called it the night the music spoke. He never grew tired of hearing that phrase because it reminded him of something beautiful, that one evening of courage could echo for a lifetime. He didn't chase attention or praise. He just kept living simply, kindly, and truthfully. And whenever someone new joined the office, people would point to him and say, "You should have seen him play the piano that night." He would always smile and say humbly, "It was nothing special." But deep down, he knew it had been everything. Months passed, but that one night never really faded away. It became one of those moments that people remembered long after the lights went out and the applause ended. For him, it wasn't about the fame or the praise, it was about what it did to his heart. That evening had opened something inside him. It gave him a kind of quiet courage that he had never known before. His days slowly settled into a new rhythm. Work was still the same, but something about it felt lighter. He no longer dragged himself to the office wondering if anyone saw his effort. Now there was a sense of belonging. His coworkers often stopped by just to chat or ask him for small favors, not out of politeness but out of genuine friendship. He had become part of the group without even trying. People still teased each other sometimes, but the mean edge that used to exist was gone. He noticed small changes, how the atmosphere at work had softened, how laughter now felt kind instead of cruel. The company's new Hidden Talents program grew fast. Every month, employees showcased their hobbies, and each time someone performed, he could see a spark in their eyes. The same spark he had felt that night when he played the piano. It was strange but beautiful to realize how one small act could inspire a chain reaction of kindness. One day, as he was walking to his desk, he overheard two people from another department talking. "You know that music night we had?" one said. "That's when I decided to start painting again. I used to love it years ago, but I stopped. Watching him play reminded me how good it feels to just do something you love." He smiled quietly and kept walking, pretending he hadn't heard. But inside, something warm bloomed in his chest. That was the real reward. Not the applause, but knowing he had helped someone else rediscover their light. The following week, the CEO invited him to his office. It wasn't unusual anymore. They often had short talks now and then. The CEO poured him a cup of tea and said, "You've started something good here. This program has changed the culture of this place." He smiled and replied, "I think people just needed a small reason to share what makes them happy." The CEO nodded thoughtfully. "True. And you gave them that reason. You didn't even plan to, you just played from your heart. Sometimes that's all it takes." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then the CEO leaned back and said, "We're organizing another big annual dinner next month. I'd like you to play again, if you're up for it." He hesitated for a second, then smiled softly. "Of course. I'd love to." When the night of the next dinner came, things felt very different from the first one. There was no anxiety, no nervousness in his chest this time. Instead, there was calm anticipation. When he walked into the ballroom, people greeted him warmly. No one whispered behind his back anymore. Some clapped him on the shoulder, saying, "We're excited to hear you again." The same grand piano stood in the corner of the stage, shining under the soft lights. He ran his fingers gently over the keys before sitting down. The sound of conversations slowly faded as everyone turned to look at him. Then he began to play. The melody was soft at first, gentle and familiar. It wasn't about showing skill or impressing anyone. It was simply about sharing a feeling. As he played, he thought about the year that had passed, about the fear he once had, the laughter that used to hurt, and the peace he had finally found. Each note carried a memory, a small piece of his journey. By the time he finished, the hall was silent for a brief moment, then filled again with warm applause. But this time it wasn't surprise that filled the air. It was appreciation, respect. The CEO stood up first, leading the applause. "You've done it again," he said as the crowd cheered. After the performance, people came to speak with him not out of curiosity but out of connection. They shared stories of their own passions, photography, writing, cooking, gardening. He realized that people were opening up more than ever, not just about their work, but about what truly mattered to them. That night, when he stepped outside into the cool evening air, he felt completely at peace. The city lights flickered, and the breeze brushed against his face. It reminded him of that first night, the night when everything changed. Except now, the feeling in his heart was different. It wasn't relief or disbelief anymore. It was quiet fulfillment. Life carried on. Seasons changed. The company grew, and so did he. He continued playing piano at small gatherings, not for attention but for joy. Sometimes, during lunch breaks, coworkers would gather around the office keyboard and hum along while he played soft tunes. It became part of their daily life, something ordinary yet special. Outside of work, he started volunteering at a local community center, teaching piano to kids who couldn't afford lessons. The first time he sat in that small, echoing room filled with old instruments, he felt nervous again, like he had gone back in time. But as soon as the children's laughter filled the air, his heart melted. They were eager, full of energy, and not afraid to make mistakes. Watching them learn reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about perfection, it was about expression, about letting something inside you come alive. Over time, he grew close to the children and their families. They'd greet him excitedly every weekend, calling him teacher with bright smiles. One little boy, after playing a song almost perfectly, said proudly, "I'm going to play in front of everyone one day, just like you did." He laughed, touched by the innocence and confidence in that voice. "You will," he said softly, "and you'll do even better." On his way home that evening, he realized something. The night he had once feared so much, the one where he was supposed to be the joke of the evening, had turned out to be the beginning of something much bigger. That night didn't just change how others saw him. It changed how he saw himself. Before, he had always seen himself as quiet, maybe even invisible. But now he understood that being quiet didn't mean being weak. It meant having the strength to wait for the right moment to speak, or in his case, to play. And when that moment came, it didn't need loudness to make an impact. It just needed honesty. Years later, people still remembered that performance. New employees who joined the company would often hear the story from others. They'd say, "There's this guy who played the piano one night, and everything changed after that." He never corrected them. He didn't need to. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming a quiet legend in the office. Sometimes, during company events, people still asked him to play. And every time, as he sat down at the piano, he smiled to himself, because it always reminded him of where it all started. At home, his old piano remained by the window, just like always. On calm nights, he'd sit down and play alone, the soft notes blending with the sounds of the city outside. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was just a conversation between him and the music. He often thought about the lessons he'd learned through it all. how kindness could grow out of misunderstanding, how courage could be found in unexpected places, and how sometimes the best way to answer ridicule is through grace. That one night had taught him that people can change. Not just others but oneself too. And that sometimes, life gives you the stage when you least expect it, not to prove others wrong, but to remind you of who you really are. He would often smile thinking about that moment. The one when the CEO had looked at him and said, "Why not? Let's see what you've got." It had sounded like a joke back then, but in truth it was the moment that opened every door that followed. One evening, as he was leaving work, he passed by the empty ballroom where it had all begun. The lights were dim, and the piano stood quietly in the corner. He walked up to it, ran his fingers along the edge and smiled. He sat down and played a few notes, soft, slow, and gentle. The sound filled the room, just like it had that first time. Only now it wasn't filled with nervousness or fear. It was filled with peace. When he finished, he stood up and looked around the quiet hall one last time. That night, he whispered softly, "I was invited to be the joke of the evening, but I ended up playing the song that changed everything." Then he turned off the lights and walked out, the faint echo of his last note lingering behind him. Proof that even the quietest voices can leave the strongest echoes.